So where Jesus says, be humble, the world generally says, be prideful, honor yourself. Where Jesus says, be generous, the world says, no, keep stuff and be greedy. And where Jesus says, be kind, the world says, just kind of walk all over people, right? Yeah, the kingdom living is what we're called to be. And I do think that's where at some point, and I happen to believe it was somewhere in and around the 1700s, just generally speaking, both in America but also in Europe, Christianity turned from focusing on kingdom living, how is it we can build God's kingdom, to how can I earn a place for my life after I die?
That was the voice of Reverend Daniel Humbert, Senior Pastor of Trietsch Memorial United Methodist Church in Flower Mound, Texas. Thanks for listening to the Life Plus God podcast. I'm your host, Alyssa Robinson, and today we're asking the question, why does the church need to change? And I think that's a pretty big assumption on my part to assume, yes, the answer is yes, the church does need to change, but why? And I think that the reason I phrased it this way is because change is an inevitable part of life. And although maybe our human default is we don't like change and we try to resist change and we want things to stay the way they are, I think all of us know that if we try to maintain things the way they are and never evolve, never change, that we're not doing the transformational work of Christ. So I think that, yes, the church does need to change, but let's talk about how and why and what we're measuring up against. Because, Daniel, I don't know what you think, but I don't think that anyone would answer, no, the church never needs to change. I don't know, maybe some people.
I imagine there'd be some people, but I hope most people would think it needs to change.
Yeah, so I don't want to scare anybody, but let's just go ahead and level set and say, hey, we're a part of this change work that needs to happen, and let's explore what that means.
Well, and we're talking Big C Church, right? I mean, certainly Trietsch doesn't need to change, right?
No, of course not. Not me, not my church. No, but I think that there is this idea of change on a macro level and also change on a micro level. It applies to us in a broad sense and in a personal sense.
Right.
And a lot of this change work, it might be systemic, it might be bureaucratic, and it might just be personal transformation that we need to take on individually.
Well, and that's what our faith is, right? I mean, our whole faith is about this transformation. So that means change.
Well, let's take a look at our church, not our church, capital C church, worldwide church today. How do you think the church today is different from the original church that we learn about in the book of Acts?
Yeah. I mean, the book of Acts is powerful, right? And as you rightfully point out, kind of identifies the early church. It's different on a couple of levels. One is the early church, as described in Acts, would have been what we would now refer to as a house church or home church. That is to say, there were no buildings, there were no structures. They gathered in people's homes. And they saw themselves as, the Greek word is ekklesia, and ekklesia is the gathering. And the gathering was not so much about people gathering in order to be a group of people, but rather it was a gathering of people who were living their faith. And so the ekklesia was not what we consider, church. It was a group of people who were living their faith in a gathered way, right? The other is that there was no bureaucracy, there was no structure other than, hey, let's gather. And one of the things that we see in the book of Acts in chapter 2, for instance, is this brief description. It's late in the chapter, and it says, they gathered and they gave themselves over to the apostles' teachings, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayers. And those four things, the apostles' teachings would essentially be scripture to us today. So they gave themselves over to these letters from Paul, for instance, or others, to the Gospels as they encountered them, to fellowship, which is hanging out, right, doing life together. It's more than just hanging out, but it's literally doing life together. Part of what we would also see in the book of Acts is that they lived communally, right? And then the breaking of the bread was kind of twofold. One was, it was communion as you and I know it, but it was also what we would now call a potluck. I mean, it was that we shared a meal, because sharing a meal, as we know today, but we don't do it nearly as regularly. When we share a meal, man, we share life, we share love, we share connection, relationship, and then finally, of course, prayers. That became kind of a formula for worship, but it also became a formula for being the ecclesia.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes the way we think, I know since I was a kid, I have been taught the church is not a building, the church is a people. So that's been kind of drilled into me. But I also think culturally, most of us, when we think of church, we think of a 1-hour worship service on Sunday morning.
Right.
That's what church is.
Yeah, and we've corrupted it that way. And I don't use that in a derogatory form, but the early church, again, saw themselves as a gathered body of people who were called to live the radical love of Jesus Christ. That's what they were called and gathered for, and that's how they saw themselves. I mean, they were also called people of the way in the book of Acts. And likewise, later in the book of Acts, they were called, someone else called them Christian, gave them that nomer. And it wasn't because they called themselves Christians, it was because people saw in them what they were doing, that they were like little Christs, right? And so that's a big difference as well, that we unfortunately don't see quite as commonly today, is this whole sense in which people would call us Christian because they saw in us Jesus. Mm-hmm. We don't tend to think of it that way.
Yeah, and even the label of Christian comes with a lot of its own baggage, because we have, to use the word used, we have corrupted it over, and not just this generation, but we've been corrupting it over centuries. And I think, a huge difference for me that I think led to this corrupting trend was how comfortable it has become to be a Christian. When you look at the first church, they were underground. They were literally hunted. And, Gracie and I have had this conversation on previous podcast episodes where, she talks about they didn't have the luxury to squabble over things that we do today. It was basically just their core focus was spreading the good news and loving people the best way that they knew how. And they didn't care who was in charge.
Right.
They didn't care how it was being taught. They didn't care about the logistics. They were just like all hands on deck at all times, and half the time scared for their lives doing this work.
And part of what you highlight as well is that their allegiance was purely and solely to Jesus, not to emperors, not to the empire, not to some bureaucracy. Their 100% total allegiance was to living like Jesus.
So if we're looking and asking the question, how does the church need to change? Is our hope that we're trying to get back to that first church structure and mentality, or is that even a possibility in today's culture?
Yeah, I think it is, but it's, number one, it's a challenge, and number two, because of that, it's a big rock to push uphill. And I would own in my own life how difficult it would be for me to make these kinds of changes. And therefore, I can get how it would be kind of hard for many people. But again, a part of it goes back to this concept. I'm going to probably berate it a little bit, but ecclesia, this just the sense that we're called to be a people and to do the works of Christ. And that's what that meant. Whereas in the 21st century, we've come to sort of make it this gathered body of people who come together to celebrate who they are and who they honor, which is not a bad thing. I mean, that's worship, but that's only one component, and we've relegated it totally and solely to that.
Do you think that if Jesus came back today and saw the church the way that it is, that he would recognize us as his followers?
Well, I think he might overturn a table or two.
So what ways do you think today's church needs to change? If Jesus is turning over tables, what tables is he turning?
Yeah. Well, I think self-sufficiency is a problem. That is to say, let's just take care of ourselves. Let's take care of either our building or our members or making sure that people become like us, right? All of that's about self, literally, all of that. And I'm guilty of that from time to time. And so part of what Jesus, I think, would say is, if we're going to build this kingdom together, we're going to need to be focused on other people. We're going to need to be focused on how do we alleviate some of the dilemmas of the day: hunger, food insufficiency, right? Water crisis, human trafficking, all of these things that are justice issues that Jesus would have been about. And we need to sort of realign ourselves with those values and make that our focus, not to the neglect of who we are as a human, but that's a part of what we're called to do.
Yeah, I think that's where I get tripped up of, like, in modern times, that feels almost impossible only because of all of the politicking that's a part of those, social justice endeavors. And this idea of, like, we're so, like you mentioned, we're so individualistic in our culture. This whole idea of communal effort, communal living, it feels like if not everyone is on board, that it can't happen. Like, you can't live communally as one. You know?
Right. And it's just hard because of our human condition. I mean, one only needs to read the first 4 chapters of the book of Acts to see, literally, the church lived together. They pooled their resources, time, energy, efforts. They pooled their food resources. They pooled their home resources. They pooled, I make up because it doesn't literally say this, their educational resources, things of that nature. And we look at that in modern day times and go, oh, yeah, I'm not doing that, right? And secondly, there's a reason we're not doing it anymore, because it's hard to do. And so even the church left that early on. Now, I maintain a part of that was they knew that community was important, right? We all know that, but they seem to live it just a heck of a lot better. But they also knew that because they were being killed for following Jesus, right?
They depended on each other in a way that we don't have to today.
Correct. And so by about the 3rd century, when Christianity becomes the empire, the religion of the empire, because the emperor says, hey, I like this thing, and let's all do it, right? I maintain, and many scholars maintain, of course, that shift with Constantine literally shifted the whole focus of the church. And here we are, golly, 1,800 years later, living out of that model, just in a modern sense. But it really is our Western sense of sort of individualism and self-sufficiency that flies in the face of what it means to be a true follower of Jesus. Because part of a true follower of Jesus is, I need you and you need me and we need each other together. And how can we depend not only on each other, but by depending on each other, how can we help the community?
So if we're looking at the worldwide church, because I think that also the divisions within the church of all the
divisions? Are there divisions?
Of all the different denominations and sects within Christianity, and there are some groups who they don't even see, like, I don't know if the Catholic Church see those Protestants as Christians. I know many Protestants who don't see Catholics as Christians, it feels silly to me because we all have the same basic tenets. But there's all of this division even within the church. How can we, because it feels like at the root of getting back to that original church mindset is this sense of unity and community.
Yeah.
How can we possibly get back to that when we are squabbling over theology and getting how do you interpret scripture and how do you see people based on the way you interpret scripture and all of that detail?
Yeah. I wish I had an answer. I mean, I've got some thoughts, and that's all I can share, right? And so one of those is, clearly this was a core value for Jesus. I mean, there's an entire chapter in the book of John where Jesus prays for this unity that you're talking about, and he prays for it pretty passionately, that we would be one. And yet, at the same time, I believe that there's value and purpose in sort of different ways of demonstrating the faith and even gathering together, i.e. denominations and sects within Christianity, because we're all different, right? And so there is a sense in which, man, either that worship style or this service style or the ways in which we engage community, we need that kind of sort of diversity, if you will, to reach people where they are. So there's nothing wrong with that innately. What becomes the problem is when we can't seem to agree on what most of us would call the basics, right? And for us as United Methodists in our particular tribe, we would say, well, it's the Apostles' Creed or perhaps the Nicene Creed, and that those sort of stipulate the basics. And by golly, we ought to agree on those things. And if we can agree on those things, then we really do find our common bond and our common purpose and what we ought to be about in our lives. And all the other stuff is just about personality or just perspective, and it shouldn't be separating. It just ought to be distinguishing, I guess is a better way to say that.
Well, so a lot of what we've been starting with is this idea of how are we changing to get back to the core values of the first church, the beginning of Christianity, and the Gospels of the way Jesus taught us to love each other. So I think that is the change that we're like, okay, let's go back to the way Jesus originally taught it. But then there's also the change that requires us to look toward the future and how are generations changing and how are we bringing in more people in a way that's relevant to them. And I know that there's a lot of tension that happens in that of like the balance between holding on to traditions and maybe not traditional thinking, but like traditional rites and rituals and things like that versus taking on new and modern approaches to experiencing God.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on balancing honoring tradition with the need for change and growth?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your using the word balance, because the balance for me comes in going back to that passage I referenced in Acts. I think it's verse 42, chapter 2, verse 42, that says, they committed themselves, apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of the bread, and prayers. That's tradition. That's the core element. And how we do that, I think you could own, just like we've owned here at Trietsch and many churches have, that there are different ways to pray, and there are different ways to celebrate communion, and there are different ways to honor Scripture, and there are clearly different ways for us to fellowship. But at the core, those four components are the tradition. And so to me, that's kind of the way we connect with tradition, is just knowing that at least those four components we need to be doing in some form or fashion. The balance then becomes, okay, so we can do those specific ways, or we can do those in unique and new ways, and yet we're still going to honor the tradition, right? And then the other thing I think that we claim as tradition is the early church basically saw itself doing two primary things. One was loving God with their whole self, and the other was loving their neighbor as their self. And those manifest themselves in how we give ourselves over to God through what we would now call spiritual practices, right? And then to love our neighbor is that we're serving them and helping them and caring for them and offering concern for them, and that we look at the bigger picture of who our neighbor is, because part of what I believe Jesus taught and what we profess is that our neighbor is anybody who might be in need, anybody who might have a desire to be in relationship, right? It's not just Methodists, or it's not just Catholics and right? I mean, it's anybody. And so that too becomes a tradition: love God, love neighbor. And then the way we balance that with contemporizing it is how we do that can be different, right?
Yeah. I think that what I see a way to balance this idea of traditional and progressive. And it's kind of, my therapist, he always told me that something I personally need to work on is being able to hold the tension of the world and not be dualistic and not see things as black and white. And that's a constant struggle for me because my default setting is to see things dualistically.
Yeah.
And I need to see more gray areas. And so I think that there is this, in some traditions, this mentality of like a more modern contemporary church, all they're doing is being flashy for the sake of drawing in new people, and it's almost sacrilegious. They're letting go of these traditions because they've got a rock band leading worship on Sunday morning, or they're doing communion in what would be considered a,
less than holy
less
way.
than sacred way. Yeah. And all of these things. And so what we're saying is like, all of it is valid and part of this diversity of church tradition.
Right, because here's the reality, and it took me seminary before I kind of understood this, because we all grow up different if we grow up in the church, right? Obviously, even if we don't. But what one person calls tradition literally probably only means what I personally have done in my life in the context of the church. What you might call tradition in terms of things you just described, whether it's style of worship, form of worship, or whatever, tradition is not the same for everybody.
Yeah.
It's literally what's traditional for one is not traditional for another. And so that's why I go back to Acts, because it gives us just what I call the foundational stuff. And those foundational things can be implemented both in what one might refer to as a traditional format, but clearly can be contemporized in a way that helps make it more relevant to the people of the day or the community or culture in which you exist.
Yeah, and I think that I agree with that, but I also think that's a very much an American mindset of like tradition only going as far back as my life or my parents' life, because my partner Jacob is a part of the Indian Orthodox Church, which is literally a 1,500-year tradition. Like their church was literally founded by St. Thomas, who was sent to India to preach the Gospels. And so it is more than just, well, my tradition is what I've experienced in my life. He can, in his family, he comes from a family of priests, and he can go back 1,000 years in his family of all of that priests and that ongoing tradition, which is just something that as an American, I do not have access to.
No, absolutely.
I don't have those roots, and I see the value in that and why you would cling so dearly to that, because it's a totally different experience.
It is. And even as rich and as tenured as that is, 1,000 years is only half of the life of the Christian church. Right? And so while that's clearly much more tenured and seasoned and lived out than what we in America do, I still have to remind myself that's only a half of the Christian faith, right?
So, well, and the 2,000 years of the Christian faith is a blip compared to the 10 million years of humanity.
Right. And so that's why I say, if we're talking about Christianity, then we talk about the whole context of it, and tradition still is different for different people.
Yeah. So looking at a more personal view, how have you, in your pastoral experience, been able to navigate change within the churches that you've been a part of? And what challenges or successes, and you can talk at a broad level or at specifics if you know a story, but what challenges and successes have you experienced in guiding people through change?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's always a challenge because, as you pointed out at the top of the session, I consider myself a change agent, but like most people, I like change that I'm helping to create versus change that somebody else is sort of bringing.
To me.
Right. And so, and yet so it's a challenge. And yet at the same time, the sort of meta picture that I paint for any church that I've tried to help lead into change is our entire faith is based on change, right? It's the coming of Jesus. It was a change. What happens to Jesus in terms of his life, his death, his resurrection is all about transformation. The ways in which that transformation has impact on our lives is all about change. And so we can't claim to be a follower of Jesus, I believe, without acknowledging that the very foundations of what the faith is about change and transformation. You even go prior to Jesus, and for me, the oft referred to story of change is the Exodus, right? So the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and man, that's a powerful story of change and transformation, and can be expressed in lots of different ways. And so, and I use this phrase often in the midst of any change that I'm trying to implement is what I call the Back to Egypt Committee, right? Because that's what the Israelites said to Moses more than once. Why didn't you just let us stay where the flesh pots were? We at least knew what all that stuff was. Mm-hmm. Now you're bringing us into other stuff, and we don't understand it, and we don't know it. And even though God helped us cross the Red Sea, and even though you struck a rock and caused water, and even though we got bread from heaven, right? Even though we've seen all of those things, and therefore we know God can do amazing things, why didn't you just leave us back in Egypt, right? Mm-hmm. So that's how hard change is.
Well, we sit down and read that story in a couple hours and we know how it ends, right? but I think that one of the biggest obstacles of change is you don't know how it's going to end.
Correct.
And that story of Exodus, when they're wandering through the desert, is 40 years. Like, people have been born and died, and, an entire generation has moved on during that 40 years. And so us being a part of change, that not only do we not know how it's going to end, but we might not live to see how it ends.
Correct.
Causes a lot of angst and fear and anxiety. And I can't imagine, I'd probably be pretty pissed off too, wandering around in the desert for 40 years, even though you see all of these good, because I can look back on my life, which is 36 years, so I'm almost at the 40-year mark, and I can see throughout my life all of the ways that God has intervened in so many different ways. But when you look at it unfolding over 36 years, it doesn't feel as impactful as if I just wrote down a bullet point list of like, here's 100 ways that God has impacted my life over 36 years, and you get to read it all at once.
Yeah. And so fear is the common anomaly, right? We're afraid of what we don't know. And part of what I also highlight for folks is, and I've never validated this, so I don't know that this is literally true, but I'm told that there are at least 365 passages of Scripture, phrases within the Scriptures that say, do not be afraid, coming from God or Jesus. And I know
that fits in nicely with our calendar, doesn't it?
Well, that's the whole point of the analogy, right? And I've never validated it, but I do know for a fact there's a whole bunch. I mean, a bunch. And so a part of what I make up from that is God knew that we, in our human condition, we're going to be fearful of change or the future. And so God says over and over and over again in various formats, I'm with you and I'm going to help you. You don't necessarily, these are not God's words. You don't necessarily need to know the end, because I'm going to be there and I'm going to help you through these kinds of things. And so that likewise is a mechanism that I use to help, implement change. But the other is to just be fully transparent. Hey, I'm afraid too. I'm looking forward to this, and I believe this is going to be helpful, and I believe this is the direction we need to go. But I don't know the full outcome, and I don't understand necessarily how this is all going to work, right? So I think transparency is also helpful. And I think Jesus kind of demonstrated that in his own life, as did the Apostle Paul. When, Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane before he's about to go to the cross, he's like, God, please just take this from me. I don't really want this. And then he follows up with, nonetheless, your will, God, that's what I want. And that's ultimately what any of us wants. So those are, and then I won't bog this conversation down too much, but part of what then begins to happen is you've got to bring people on board gradually, right? Some through personal conversation, some through the formal and elected leadership, then some through what are known as just informal leaders, because every church, every organization has both formal leaders and what I call informal leaders, people who have influence.
The influencers,
Yeah, but they're not in any formal structured leadership. And then finally to the whole congregation, right? Because that way you've got sort of a groundswell. You've got people who help you and they help form whatever that change may be. And then you take it before the entire congregation in a way that is helping to alleviate the fears, because you can never remove the fear. You just want to try to minimize the fear. and help them to see this is all about trust. God asks us to trust, and that's what I'm going to ask you to do.
Mhm. So, with the way that our world is changing so rapidly, so let's say within the first 1800 years of Christianity, 1900 years of Christianity, yes, we saw change, but it was slow and gradual as culture and society and technology was evolving over time. But now we are at this time in history where change is so rapid that it's difficult to keep up with. You don't even have time to adjust to changes that have happened socially, culturally, technologically until something new is introduced.
Yep.
How can the church stay relevant and meaningful in a world that is evolving so quickly?
Well, valid question. And it goes back to kind of the issue we talked about earlier, which is in order to be relevant, i.e. sort of quote unquote progressive, right? This sense of how can we help meet people where they are or whatever, is we got to understand culture. We've got to be in culture. We've got to understand the ways in which people live and are motivated and inspired and understand things and choose how they want to engage. And so that's the first thing, rather than be a church or a people who say, we're going to create our own culture and we're going to sort of hibernate over here and we're going to stay out of that stuff and we're never going to participate in that stuff and we're just going to be an island unto ourselves.
Well, and I think that that is a huge mistake that we've made as a global church. And one of the things that needs to change is in many ways, especially in our culture, we've become separatists.
Correct.
Where we have our own private Christian schools, private Christian sports leagues, private Christian, you name it. There is a Christian version of it where you can be around like-minded people.
Christian dieting programs.
Right, exactly, who aren't going to challenge you.
Yep. Well, so I get all that, and you're absolutely right. And I don't want to necessarily poo-poo all that because, I mean, there is a sense in which I understand the reasons for that, and there are good reasons for it, but it really ultimately flies in the face of what Jesus called us to do, right? Which was to be with and among the people, to reach across lines, to have relationships with people that are different from us. That's what Jesus did over and over and over again. That's what he called the disciples to do. Go, therefore, into all the world. That's biblical language for go talk to the guy who is of no faith or a Muslim, or go be with somebody who has a different set of values than you, or go be with folks who have different cultural backgrounds than you, right? That's what that means. And so how is it that we can be the church when we isolate, when we build our own little fiefdoms, right? It doesn't work.
But I think that we've interpreted that as go into the world and recruit people to your side.
I agree.
And bring them into your fiefdom.
Yeah. And that's not how Jesus did it, nor the early church as well. One of the beautiful ways that the early, again, in the book of Acts, evangelized, which is obviously to help people come to know Jesus, right? The beautiful way they did it was they went into people's homes in other communities. In other words, they went to be with them proactively, literally lived in their homes, ate their food, accepted their hospitality, and they did all of that first. In other words, ingrained themselves in the lives of people, and then they began to talk about this guy named Jesus. And what that does is that number one, that demonstrates humility, right? It says, I want to know you first. I want to understand who you are, what your background is, what your values are. I want to know you first. And I want to be, in a sense, dependent on you. I'm going to sleep in your home, and I'm going to eat your food, and I'm going to hear your stories, and I'm going to come to understand who you are. And then when the time seems appropriate, and they never describe when that is, and I make up that's because it's different for every relationship, right? At some point, we start to talk about what our faith is, and we begin to reveal it in such a way that it is inspirational and captivating and generates questions that are curious, right? And so that form of evangelism is something we ought to sort of ignite, right? Is How do I go spend time with you, whoever you are, and I get to know you and appreciate you and honor you and value you before I ever mention the word Jesus, before I ever talk about my faith, before I ever identify that I use this book called the Bible that helps guide I know everything about you before I say anything about me. And that's a radical shift, right? So that's one suggestion. Now, you ask, I've lost track of the question.
How do we keep up? How do we keep up
Yeah.
with this rapidly changing world as a church?
Yeah. So again, it speaks into this whole sense of which we've got to be engaged with the culture and understand it so that we can then figure out a way to engage it so that it's captivating. That is to say, the message of Jesus. But one of the ways we have to engage is in this concept of loving our neighbor. And that takes any number of forms, right? Serving, caring, providing, being.
I've often heard the phrase from Christians that we are called to be in the world, but not of the world.
Yeah. That's scriptural.
What does that mean? So where does that come from in Scripture, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah. So it comes from Paul. I forget the letter, but Paul is trying to help us identify, again, a way to engage the world. And basically it means we have to exist. We have to eat and drink and sleep and write and work, if you will. So it means be in the world, because you wouldn't be human if you didn't exist in the world. But don't be of the world to the extent that you let your values found in Jesus of kindness and humility and peace and patience and all of those things, that you let those get corrupted, right? However they might get corrupted, that you be people of the way. And so instantly that puts us at crosshairs, right? How do we exist in a culture that may not value the same things we value, and yet how do we still maintain our distinctiveness as a follower of Jesus?
And so it seems like what some of us have done is said, okay, we're going to live here, but we're going to pull away.
Correct.
And it feels like what we should be doing is we're going to live here, we're going to participate, and we're not going to fall victim to greed and power and pride and all of these things that the world is throwing at us. We're going to live in the countercultural way of love and forgiveness and mercy and all the things that Jesus taught. And so when we're saying we're not of the world, we're saying we're fighting against the default settings of this world.
Correct. So where Jesus says, be humble, the world generally says, be prideful, honor yourself. Where Jesus says, be generous, the world says, no, keep stuff and be greedy. And where Jesus says, be kind, the world says, just kind of walk all over people, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the kingdom living is what we're called to be. And I do think that's where at some point, and I happen to believe it was somewhere in and around the 1700s, just generally speaking, both in America but also in Europe, Christianity turned from focusing on kingdom living, how is it we can build God's kingdom, to how can I earn a place for my life after I die? And that whole focus changed Christianity. And then in America, it just mushroomed. Mm-hmm. I'm pleased to say I find many denominations and or non-denominational churches over the last decade or so who've kind of changed their focus from, hey, you need to earn a place in heaven, right? You got to secure a seat, to being kingdom-building churches. And I'm very appreciative of that. And I think that's a shift change that was needed and is a positive thing.
So when we're looking at being in the world and participating in this culture, but through the lens of our faith, what role do you think inclusivity plays in the church's need to change? And when I'm thinking about inclusivity, I'm thinking of things about like the LGBTQ plus community, issues on that we see around us on racism and gender inequality and rights for people with disabilities, and all this huge tapestry of humanity that we have, what is the church's role in this all-inclusive, open, being in the world mentality?
Well, I think we only need to look at Jesus and the book of Acts to see that Jesus was with and for everybody, right? He spoke to people who were outcast. He had relations with women and connected with people that were considered by the culture and even the Jewish tradition at the time second-class citizens. So just by Jesus's actions and interactions, we see that inclusivity is a core to who he is. Would he have used the word? No. But could he describe the purpose that this is important and that it's a value of the kingdom? Absolutely. On the other hand, in the book of Acts, we begin to see like one of the very first churches identified in Acts chapters 13 and 15. It was a very diverse church. It had people from Turkey. It had people from Greece. It had people from Rome. It had people from Cyprus, an island. So part of what that suggests is different cultures, different ethnicities. In that early church, there were two from North Africa, so they were Africans. Again, Turkey, and then Cyprus, and then Rome. So you've got sort of an official representative, if you will, of the empire even. So, man, to me that just says the early church became so well known for inclusivity because that's what it was made of. And that's where they were first called Christians.
Well,
how powerful is that?
Was that something that was kind of unheard of at the time? Like
Yes.
that mixing of cultures just
Correct.
didn't happen?
No, that's correct. And some of that comes from just sort of tribal understanding, right? From even long before Christianity. Certainly within the Jewish tradition, it was, don't intermarry and don't intermingle. Certainly from even the Babylonian and later Persian empires, it was don't associate with anybody outside of you. But Christianity said, everybody is welcome and all can participate. And the book of Revelation identifies that as well, of every tribe, race, and nation, John would say in the Revelation, will come and glorify God together. I don't know what else could express, inclusivity than that, right? People of every tribe, race, and nation. That's ancient language for even some of the other things that you've described.
So since we're in the past, what lessons can the church today learn from past reforms or periods of transformation in history that can guide us through changes that need to happen today?
Oh, man. I don't know. So there have been these major shifts, right? So we talked about in the 4th century when Constantine sort of made the church the official religion of the empire. And then in the 16th century when the printing press came and, that's when we get the Gutenberg Bible, right? And so print begins to change. And therefore, the common person begins to have access to the Bible. These are some of the tectonic changes, right? 4th century, 16th century. And now I kind of believe we're in another one that both technology, AI, and other things are going to create a massive shift in how Christianity is both lived and pervade. I don't know how to answer that question, though. I just know that there are these major shifts that took place, and basically the church captivated the opportunity, right? And it shifted the church in both very positive ways and very negative ways, right? The first tectonic shift when Constantine makes it the religion of the empire, man, it's a little easier to participate now, right? I'm not going to get killed. And I can have sort of influence on even politics, if you will, or the power of the day. Those are positive. The negative becomes if you're not a part of us, then we're going to put you out, right? Quite literally the opposite of what had been happening to Christians. Now Christians start doing that thing to others.
Now we're the persecutors.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then when the printing press comes, by golly, the church is early to the rise to say, man, let's get the Bibles in the hands of people, right? that's a huge thing. That's tremendously positive. Unfortunately, what it also does is it creates the opportunity for misinterpretation. It creates the opportunity for an acknowledgement that we may have answers that we're going to push on people when really it creates more questions than answers, right? So there's always positive and negative with any of the shifts.
Yeah, and the Protestant Reformation as well.
Right.
There's positive and negative that comes out of that. One of the trends that I see as you were talking through, well, I don't know as much about the reign of Constantine, but as you're talking through like the Gutenberg Bible and the printing press, one of the things that came to mind to me is through every point of change in history, there are going to be people fighting it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember reading about that in my history classes with the printing of the Bible. Many people in the Catholic Church were against it
Yep.
because they didn't want the common person to be able to have access
Right.
to the Bible, because then that took away their power
Mm-hmm.
to teach and interpret how they wanted to. And it was
Right.
the same thing when churches started to shift over from speaking Latin,
Mm-hmm.
which it's been a dead language for a long time. And even back when churches were exclusively in Latin, the people didn't speak Latin.
Correct.
But that gave the leaders of the church control
Yep.
over the people of, I'm the only one who understands this. And there were people fighting against that change, going from Latin to a common language.
Correct.
And so what I take away is through every major change in history, there will be people fighting it
Yep.
and trying to keep it from happening. And that can be frustrating, but what I see over and over and over again is progress always wins. Change always wins. Change will happen. And yeah, you can try to thwart it, but that will only it will only create a hurdle, but it won't stop change.
Right. Right. And therefore, I think our calling as leaders within the church is to try to captivate positive change that helps bring us more in line with kingdom values, right? Humility, compassion, right living, if you will, living into justice and mercy, and helping drive people to that so that it's a part of their everyday life. And does it cause change? Yeah, it causes change, but it's positive change and it's helpful change.
So we've been talking about all of the ways the church could change or reclaim how we started, all of these things. Are there some ways that you think the church today should not change? Is there anything that we need to absolutely hold on to?
Well,
in the modern church?
Yeah, I know that's, number one, it's a good question. I think where we get it right, we ought not change those things, right? Where we get loving God and loving neighbor right, we need to keep that. Where we get serving the world and serving the community right, we need to keep that. Where we perpetuate God's mercy and justice, we need to keep that. I think virtually almost anything else is on the table. Now, I don't mean things like sacraments, right, or how we apply the core teachings of Scripture to our life. I'm not talking about changing those things, but I mean just I think the way we live as faithfully as we can to what we're called to be as followers of Jesus, we need to continually perpetuate that.
Well, lastly, to wrap us up, for those who love the church but feel frustrated by what they see as the church's resistance to change, because oftentimes it's two sides of a coin. The church is often at the forefront of change, but the church has also been dragging our feet in a lot of different ways. So if someone is listening to this and they are frustrated they think the church is dragging their feet, they feel like they're in the book of Exodus wandering through the desert for 40 years and nothing's changing. What advice or encouragement would you offer to them to help them stay engaged and hopeful?
Yeah. The first thing I'd say is I see you, because I'm frustrated too. And I see that the church, even under my leadership, whether here or elsewhere, has not done all that we can. And so I see you. That's the first thing. The second thing I would just say is hang in there. I believe there is hope, and I believe that we can get there. Now, not necessarily in every realm and at every turn, but the only way we can get there is when we pool our resources and when we work together and when we value one another. Otherwise, man, we live back into our isolationism and in our separatism. And so I would just say, hang in there. Find fellow followers who feel and think the way you do, and identify ways that we can work together to make the change happen.
I can't remember who said it. Maybe you'll remember, but be the change you want to see in the world.
Yeah.
It's a super famous quote. I'm sure it's someone like Oprah or something like that said it. But if you're
is that John Lewis? Maybe John Lewis said that. I can't remember.
It sounds like something John Lewis would say. But I think that finding that community of people who are also a little frustrated and they want to see change happen, and y'all can work together to be that change, to create that loving environment that you are frustrated that you don't see. You can be a part of building that.
Correct.
But then that'll open a whole new can of frustrations, but it's worth it. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for having this conversation with me, and I hope to have you on again soon.
Indeed.
The Life Plus God podcast is hosted, written, and produced by me, Alyssa Robinson, and sponsored by Trietsch Memorial United Methodist Church in Flower Mound, Texas. Check out Trietsch online at tmumc.org or in person to see if this church is a right fit for you and your family. We'd love for you to visit us soon. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and rate us on your podcast platform to help other people find our content. Join us next week, and let's keep growing in relationship with Christ together.